Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. The as yet unresolved case of the University of Idaho killings is a disturbing one. 4 university students were found stabbed to death in their shared 3-storey 6-bedroom accommodation on November the 13th, 2022. 2 students who resided in the property would stumble upon one of their roommates passed out on the floor. When they were unable to wake their roommate, they called some friends over to the property to help them out. It doesn't sound as though they believe that a crime had been committed, rather a freak accident or too much alcohol consumption. Ultimately, 911 would soon be informed of the situation and showed up to provide assistance. It would quickly be established that this wasn't just a freak accident, and that the person laying unconscious on the ground was actually deceased. Police responded following this discovery and came upon 3 more students. Each would be pronounced dead from stab wounds at the scene. There'd been a quadruple homicide in the property, and the coroner who worked the case would mention seeing lots of blood spatter on the wall. The investigation began, and police would begin trying to piece together the series of events leading up to the murders. They started off by learning the names of those who had brutally lost their lives. The names of these students were Kaylee Gongarves, Madison Mogan, Ethan Chapin and Zana Knodel. All of the victims were students at the nearby University of Idaho. The crime scene was located just off campus, in the college town of Moscow, Idaho. The town's population is roughly 25,000 people. Police had quite a bit of information to go on in relation to the last known movements of the 4 students. All 4 had been out on the night prior to their murders. Ethan and Zana were in a relationship and had been out to a college party, whilst Kaylee and Madison had been drinking at a nearby bar. Surveillance video would capture Kaylee and Madison purchasing food in the early morning hours of November 13th. Having picked up their orders, the girls then got a lift back to their accommodation. They arrived back shortly after Ethan and Zana. Sometime in the early morning hours, someone had managed to sneak into the property and take the lives of these young people. Police would speak to one of the roommates in the house, someone who resided on the 2nd floor. It would be learned that they had seen the killer. At around 4 AM, this person was awoken by what sounded like Kaylee playing with her dog. The roommate then heard Kaylee say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." Kaylee and Madison were sharing a room, as were Ethan and Zana, so Kaylee was probably speaking to Madison. Some time passed before the roommate thought that they could hear someone crying, followed by an unknown male voice say, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." The roommate opened their bedroom door and spotted a tall male dressed entirely in black clothing. A mask covered his mouth and nose, and the roommate stood in complete shock as the figure walked past her and left through a sliding glass door. Police could find no signs of forced entry to the property, or any damaged doors or prying of windows. It would seem as though the killer had managed to gain entry through an unlocked door, and there's always the possibility that he'd been lurking somewhere in the house hours before. I'm guessing that leaving doors open is a common occurrence in a college town, and let's face it, nobody could have expected anything like this to have gone down after all. Police would hold multiple press conferences over the coming month as they desperately sought out information about the quadruple slaying. Classes were cancelled, and it was beginning to mirror the case of the Gainesville Ripper out of Florida. The same feelings of worry, fear and frustration existed. This was made even worse by police press conference statements and a seeming lack of case progression. Some of the statements were abrupt, and statement backtracking had victim family members and local people feeling both confused and frustrated. A good example of this was when law enforcement made the statement that Moscow police do not believe there is an ongoing community risk based on information gathered during the preliminary investigation. They reversed this statement the following day when they said, "We cannot say there's no threat to the community." Law enforcement seemed overwhelmed with the attention and magnitude of what had just occurred. It's understandable that they made some mistakes when making statements, as new updates were emerging by the hour and constant leads flooded into the set-up tip line for the investigation. I'm assuming that in the early stages of the investigation, they felt as though the killer was someone who knew one of the victims, because they stated that evidence pointed toward a targeted attack. It is believed that a fixed knife murder weapon had been used by the killer, and this suggested a more personal, crime of passion murder motivation. As the college community of Moscow grieved at the loss of 4 of its students, the police would continue requesting information. By November 20th, they had carried out over 90 interviews and had received 646 tips of potential interest. Police would learn about Zana having a stalker around this same time and looked into that theory. It didn't lead anywhere as nobody was identified as being one, but it opened a new line of inquiry. Perhaps one of the students had been stalked prior to the murders and was the main focus of the killer. There were some suspects by this stage in the investigation, but all were cleared pretty fast. They included the person who had served Kaylee and Madison food and the person who dropped them off at their accommodation. It would be on December 7th that the biggest break in the case came. A 2011 to 2013 model Hyundai Elantra had been noticed close to the crime scene around the same time that the quadruple homicide occurred. Through surveillance footage and probably ANPR camera footage, police would trace the vehicle to a 28-year-old man named Brian Coburger. I have to say that the 28-year-old gives me Lou Bloom vibes, and it would come out that he owned the same exact vehicle. Brian was a criminology student at Washington State University, which is only a 15-minute drive over the state border. It would be learned that Brian had returned to his home state of Pennsylvania, and in a police traffic stop from December 15th, he can be seen alongside his father talking to police. Both Brian and his dad were driving from Washington back to Pennsylvania on a 2,500-mile cross-country road trip. Police had a prime suspect in their sights and conducted DNA testing. Now that Brian Coburger was a suspect, the police linked offender DNA at the quadruple homicide crime scene to his through genealogy technology. This is something that has proved beneficial in serial killer cases like the Grim Sleeper and original Night Stalker cases. In those cases, family members of the offender matched the DNA, and their genetic makeup helped to narrow in on the actual offender. The killers in those cases were eventually convicted in many unsolved murders. As mentioned, Brian was a criminology student and had apparently been studying under Catherine Ramsland, who interviewed infamous serial killer Dennis Rader and did a book with him. The fact that Brian was studying criminology really says a lot about his personality. He probably has an obsession with true crime and clearly dedicated a lot of his time to learning about real life crime and serial murder. Dennis Rader, or BTK as he is more commonly known, had a habit of stalking women before breaking into their homes and murdering them. Some of Rader's intended victims had been stalked by him during the daytime, whilst he attended night classes at community college in El Dorado, Kansas. Rader said that the college classes provided him with good cover. He could say that he was in the library when he was in fact scouting out potential victims. Rader was in his late 20s at this time, and years later he'd go on to earn a bachelor's degree from Wichita State University. During the 1970s, he kept up with different classes and all the while managed to continue killing people. Now, I don't know if the killer, and let's not forget that Brian is still considered innocent until proven guilty, intended on there being more than one person in the house, or if he intended on killing more than one person. That's not known, but if stalking had taken place prior to the murders, then it makes sense that the killer would have known that there would be more than one person in the house and decided that the risk was worth it. To me, the crime signifies an inexperienced offender given the amount of blood that was described as being present at the crime scene. A more experienced offender would know that murder doesn't have to be bloody. The use of a knife highlights the intended up-close and personal motivation of the killer. It speaks to a built-up rage inside him and a desire to inflict pain on an innocent person. Police would later go on to reveal that there was no signs of sexual assault to the victims. This doesn't necessarily mean that the crime wasn't sexually motivated though. Personally, I feel like the crime was sexually motivated. Brian Coburger would be arrested at his family home on December 30th, and recently he waived his rights to extradition and was sent back to Idaho to face a judge. Brian now sits in the local county jail awaiting trial on 4 counts of first-degree murder. When you look at this case and the suspect, you begin to realise just how guilty he looks. From the vehicle match to his chosen area of study and the DNA match, Brian looks very guilty. I feel as though the physical evidence and the circumstantial evidence points to him as being the sole culprit, at least from my perspective. Did he become too obsessed with murder and wanted to engage in his own twisted crime? Or is he an innocent man? We'll just have to wait and see. Rest in peace to Ethan, Zana, Kaylee and Madison. Their futures have been cut short by a monster, and they were all just living their lives, enjoying the moment. It's a shame that we can't see these tragic events coming, but that's just a sad reality of life. We never truly know what's around the corner, and so I hope that you stay aware to what's going on around you and enjoy the time spent with your close friends and family. Oftentimes situations like this are impossible to prevent, but I hope that justice is served in this case, despite closure never being fully attainable for the victims' families. This has been the video on the Idaho college murders. As always, thank you for watching.